His passion in his career was flying, and there are two phases to his career. Now, the first part was in World War II when he served with the Royal Australian Air Force, and he served in the battles of the Atlantic, Mediterranean and the Pacific. And the second part, closely followed by that, was flying for BOAC. I think most of you are probably old enough to remember BOAC, but it's one of the airlines that merged to what is now current BA, or British Airways. And though my presentation covers his early life, I've tried to put this in context with what he did in World War II and what else was going on. And also, in the 1970s, after he retired, he spent a lot of time writing up his account of his World War II service, which he then typed up and amended the type with lots of snowflake and scribblings and things. And I took that off him and converted it into an electronic document and gave it back to him. Sadly, when he died in 2010, that was still in his drawer. And during lockdown, looking for something to do, I got the manuscript out again, made some further editorial changes, corrections and things, historical corrections, put some photographs in from his albums and tried to get a publisher to publish it without any success. I'll tell you a bit more about that later. Anyway, let's press on with the presentation. Here he is, sitting in the cockpit of a Sunderland flying boat. You'll note he's got a cup of tea in his hand. The flying boats were very well equipped for long missions because they'd be out for 10 or 12 hours or more over the Atlantic. And they had bunks on board for the crew, a wardroom with a table and chairs, a primer stove with 2 burners and an oven, so they could cook meals and such. The military equipped them with crockery and knives and forks, but the Australians didn't like the stuff that they were given. So they very carefully collected matching sets from the hotels near where they were billeted. Hence the elegant teacup there. And one day the unimaginable happened when a German bullet came up through the hull and broke the sugar bowl. That really upset them considerably. His early years, he was born in Sydney, Australia, in the area called Concord, which seems appropriate, in 1916. And like a lot of children of that era, coming towards the end of World War I, he was christened Victor. His dad was a sign writer and worked for British American lead manufacturing. But my dad always wanted to fly. Inevitably, in 1931, he got a job with that company. In 1933, still trying to pursue his career in aviation, he got a job as a storekeeper at Mascot Airport in Sydney and attended an evening course on aircraft construction at Sydney Technical College. I'll put this a bit more in context here. The pictures you see across the bottom there, on the left-hand side, there's a picture of Charles Kingsford Smith flying over the incomplete Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, my dad being a schoolboy at that time, when the bridge was open, they got all the school children lined up across the tarmac on the apron of the bridge in front of the tape so they could see the ceremony. But without more ado, a horseman rode up out of the crowd with a sword, cut the tape and disappeared back into the crowd again. So I guess Australian style, the bridge was open. The second one from the left, some of you may recognise as Sir Francis Chichester. Well, during those years, early years, he was busy pioneering air routes across the South Pacific. And it's no wonder that he called his yacht Gypsy Moth, because those were the aircraft that he flew in those years. Coming nearer to home, there's the Hinkler pub in Southampton, in Sholing. Now, Bert Hinkler was an Australian airman. He served with the Royal Flying Corps and then the RAAF in World War I. And when that was over, he got a job working for AV Row in Southampton. He built himself a house with his wife, which you'll see on the right there. And unfortunately, that house, the Southampton Council wanted to knock down. Word got out, and a group of enthusiasts from Australia rushed across here, bought the house, dismantled it brick by brick, transported it to Australia, to Bundaberg in Queensland, and rebuilt it. And there it is today, alongside an aircraft museum. So you won't see the house anymore, but the pub, the Hinkler, is actually on Hinkler Road in Southampton. Now, he did have 4 brothers and 1 sister. 2 of his brothers, Frank and Roy, were official Australian World War II artists and served in the Western Desert, Borneo and Papua New Guinea. The left-hand photograph is by Frank of troops crossing a rope bridge in New Guinea. And the right-hand photograph is by Roy of 2 Navy technicians disarming a mine. Frank was awarded the Australian Medal for his work. There was also another brother who was an amateur artist called Corbett, or Corb, which was the practice in those days for people of Gaelic origin to name their first son after the wife's maiden name. He became an artist too. We got some paintings of my dad of him at home. Frank actually produced this watercolour of my mum in the early 1940s. I think it's a rather lovely painting. Right, his flying years. Just a summary here. He joined the RAAF as a storekeeper in 1937, and his number was 463, very low number. And in 1939, the unexpected happened. He was offered a flying sergeant's course at RAF Point Cook. Now, this is unexpected because in those days, places on those courses were given to the sons of professional people like doctors and accountants and lawyers. He was just the son of a signwriter. In 1939, he and 3 others was flown to the UK to collect 9 short Chandlers to take back to Australia. The rest of the crews were already here and they travelled to the UK by boat. So these were the last 3 to arrive, and they were sent by aircraft. And when he got there, he was sent on a heavy flying boat course down the water here at Cowshot. And when that was complete, 10 Squadron was formed at RAF Mountbatten. In 1942, with the war underway in the Pacific, experienced air crews were needed in Australia, and a number of the personnel from 10 Squadron was sent back there. In 1946, however, he resigned from the RAAF and returned to UK in answer to an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald for experienced flying boat crews to come and join them and fly their flying boat fleet to the Empire. In 1971, he actually retired from BOAC with almost 20,000 flying hours in his logbooks. Point Cook, the flying course. It's fairly basic by today's standards. Here you see some of the recruits doing parachute practice, instructions on bombs. There's the cockpit of one of the aircraft there. There's machine gun practice top right. And bottom right, there's a flight of Westland Wapitis, which they use for training purposes. Here's another picture from Point Cook of the aircraft on the apron in front of the buildings, all biplane aircraft like Tiger Moths, Westland Wapitis and Avro Avians. Middle photograph is my dad, second from the right, having gained his wings with several of his fellow recruits. 2 of them he became steadfast friends with for the rest of their lives. To the left of my dad is a guy called Athol Galway Hope Wern. Strange mix of names. He probably named after an atlas, I think. His nickname became Atty, and to his left is another guy called Gilbert Thurston. They called him Thirsty Thurston. And they remained firm friends for the rest of their lives. And the three of them came to the UK together. Top right is my dad receiving his wings at the passing out parade. Here are some of the aircraft that they flew. Bottom left-hand photograph is Supermarine Southampton. They had one left at that stage. That's a posed photograph for the press, and there's my dad, Atty and Gilbert, or Thirsty, sitting on the tractor. Top photograph there is what the Australians know as an Australian Supermarine Walrus. No, sorry, I've got that wrong. Supermarine Seagull. It's a Seagull 5. Now, a lot of you may think, well, that's a Supermarine Walrus. Well, it became known as that in the latter years. When it was on the drawing board, it was a Seagull 5, and that's what the Australians called it thereafter. In Australian parlance, it's still a Seagull. Middle photograph is parachute practice. In this instance, the recruits were equipped with a parachute. They climbed onto the wings of this flying boat, hung onto the struts, and the given signal released their parachutes, were plucked off the aircraft and floated back to the earth. Except in this photograph, they're over the sea, or from where the aircraft's taken off, so they must have come back to earth. Top right is a Western Wapiti, and bottom right is a Tiger Moth float plane of the type that Sir Francis Chichester flew. Now, I said that they flew to the UK to catch up with the rest of 10 Squadron. In those days, the route was via Qantas Airways and Imperial Airways. It's a 12-day trip, something that's done in about 24 hours now. They stopped every night and were offloaded into hotels where they had a formal dinner, slept in a nice comfortable bed, and the next morning they had breakfast in the hotel, got back on the aircraft and took off and made a couple of stops on the way to refuel, collect and deliver mail, other passengers and cargo and such. Now, my dad was a sign writer's son, and he'd never experienced such luxury before, so it was quite a surprise to him. When the aircraft got to the UK, the main landing area was Poole Harbour down here, and they get on a bus and go up to London. Poole remained the main flying boat harbour airport throughout World War II, and flights from the US came in there, as well as flights to Africa and wherever they could get to. Right. A couple of images for you. There's a photograph there of one of the Australian flying boats. The VH isn't in honour of my dad, it's the classification for all Australian aircraft. And that's the type of aircraft they flew. And you can see the launch, they came ashore in there with some of the passengers. And on the right there is his certificate for crossing the equator with Qantas. Now, when they came to the UK, they landed at Poole, they went up to London, reported to the Australian High Commission, who ordered them to get uniforms made because their uniforms were coming by ship. They weren't allowed to take them on the aircraft because the war was on then and the aircraft went through neutral countries. So they were told to get uniforms made and report to RAAF Cowshot. Now, the uniforms became a problem later because the Australian uniforms were much, much darker blue than the RAAF ones. Here is RAAF Cowshot in the latter part of the war. You can see several Sunderland flying boats there. Many of these buildings have now gone. The big hangar on the left-hand side is a sports centre, and at the bottom is a Martello Tower, which remains there today. And it's run by English Heritage, and if you ever go in there, there is a small museum in there with models and photographs of flying boats related to the flying boat days there. Cowshot is also associated with Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who served down there working on high-speed launches, and also the Snyder Trophy races, which were the interwar races between several nations to develop the fastest seaplane that they could. It was actually won outright by the UK 3 times, and the trophy was maintained by the UK and can be found in the Solar Sky Museum in Southampton, together with winning aircraft. Right, we're at Cowshot, heavy boat, flying boat plane training. These were some of the aircraft that were down there at the time. The top left is a short Empire flying boat. My dad didn't fly that, but this is one down there in wartime camouflage. Then you've got the Sarah Lerwick, bottom one there. That was a development by Saunders Roe in Cowes across the water in the Isle of Wight. And it wasn't a successful aircraft. It was planned as a short-range flying boat like the Sunderland, but for inshore water use. It wasn't a success, and they were withdrawn from service. The other flying boats there that they practiced on were twin-wing biplane flying boats, which they flew with varying ranges of success. Several of them had so much weed on the bottom they couldn't take off, and they were just used for taxiing. Other ones they flew but tended to break down, which I'll tell you about later. On one very, very cold day, my dad had been out practicing flying, and they knew if they got back by lunchtime, they could go to the mess and have a hot meal. And the mess, if you've ever been down to Cowshot, was on the mainland there. So they got back early, landed the flying boat successfully, tethered it up on the troughs down towards what is now the Fawley refinery, and waited for a launch to come out. Nothing happened, so they started waving and shouting, still no launch. So one of them came up with a great idea of firing a very pistol rocket into the sky to attract attention, which is what they did. It sailed beautifully up into the sky and came down on the next flying boat, which it set light and burnt to the waterline. The boat came out very fast, spent all its time putting the fire out on this other flying boat and not getting them off their boat for their hot dinner, so they didn't get a hot meal that day. There used to be a little steam train that used to run along the spit from Eagle House Camp on the mainland out to where the flying boats were kept, and personnel and cargo would go on that. And one evening at the mess dinner, in the very cold winter of 1940, when pipes were freezing, telegraph wires were coming down through the ice and such, the daughters of the commander of the base came up to me, Dad, and said, we admire you Australians, you're very, very fit and strong, and we like that. And my dad said, well, hang on a minute. He said, we're not doing that to keep fit. He said, we're doing it to keep warm, because it's so cold, and they only had their basic uniforms. They used to run out to the spit and back. Anyway, word got round, and the RAAF officers there had a whip round, got them some Burberry overcoats. One of the training flights they did was out to Guernsey with 3 of these flying boats. And as I said, they kept breaking down, and this situation was no exception. During the 4 days my dad was there, he only completed about an hour and a half of flying due to unserviceability of the flying boats. That gave him and his mates an opportunity to explore the island, and they had a good time. They found that beer was 4p a glass, champagne cocktails 9p, and scotch was 6p. And he said he'd never tasted alcohol before, but this changed his mind. However, this was 1940, the war was underway, the Germans were approaching along the coast, they couldn't get the aircraft to start, so they abandoned them and came back on the steamer you see bottom right. Little bit of technical data about the short Sunderland. 4 Bristol Pegasus radial engines. They didn't like those engines because they weren't that reliable, and they also needed servicing every 300 hours. And also you could not feather the engine, so if the engine stopped through mechanical failure, the propellers kept rotating, and that slowed the aircraft down. What they wanted was something they could actually stop the propellers rotating. Total production was over 700 aircraft. 10 Squadron, through its time in the UK throughout World War II, had about 70 of these aircraft on its inventory. only 9 in operation at one time. Many of those aircraft crashed or were shot down or were wrecked in storms. Others got transferred onto other squadrons. And also, the aircraft were built at Rochester, Belfast, Dumbarton by Blackburns and Lake Windermere. Now, Rochester was very close to the continent, so Shorts wanted somewhere else they could build them because of the demand for the aircraft. Dumbarton on the Clyde was chosen. Blackburns was the factory there making the aircraft, but the Australians refused to fly them because of the unserviceability, and they reckoned they were dangerous, and they refused to fly them until all the faults were put right on them. And also on Lake Windermere. Now, we also always think of Lake Windermere as a beautiful place, one of the founding places of the National Trust, and Beatrix Potter lived there. And despite the war, the National Trust were very reticent about allowing a factory to go up on the side of their pristine lake. The Air Ministry prevailed, the factory was built, about 90 aircraft were built there, and at the end of the war, the factory was removed as quickly as possible, and only the concrete standing lays there at the moment. Now, this photograph I like just because what's in there. There's one of the Australian Sunderlands on the Catwater at Plymouth, and they're sailing out to sea as HMS Hood. The only problem is trying to date this photograph, because we know that HMS Hood was sunk on the 24th of May 1941, but according to the 10 Squadron records, that sunken wasn't delivered till August of that year. So the latter must be wrong in some way, or maybe the aircraft was just delivered there and wasn't actually taken on charge until August. What did my dad do to Mountbatten? Well, you may be aware that an attempt was made at the beginning of the war to encourage the French government to keep fighting the Germans, albeit from North Africa. Well, to that end, 2 Sunderlands were sent out from Plymouth to try and persuade the French to continue fighting. One with Lord Gort on board went to Rabat in North Africa and was unsuccessful in persuading the French to continue fighting. In fact, the French tried to arrest Lord Gort and his aide-de-camp and the Australian crew, but there was a running battle and the Australians turned the tables on the French, got back to their aircraft, having kidnapped the French chief of police, and didn't let him go until they were taking off. The other aircraft, my dad on board, the left-hand photograph, took Lord Lloyd and his aide-de-camp from Plymouth to Bordeaux, and they landed on Lake Biscarrosse, which was a Pan-American base then, which you see there. When they got aboard in Plymouth, Lord Lloyd hoisted a case of champagne on board, hoping to celebrate on the way back. They weren't successful, and on the way back, Lord Lloyd and his PA cooked the crew a meal, and as they left the aircraft, they took a bottle of champagne out of the case and gave the rest to the crew to finish off. Another thing that happened while he was at Plymouth was an encounter with a Focke-Wulf Condor, which you see on the top right there. Now, that was a conversion of the Focke-Wulf Courier long-range passenger aircraft, and these would do patrols out in the Atlantic, right around the UK, from France right up to Norway. They were a very dangerous aircraft because they were much faster than the Sunderlands and much heavier armed. It had a 20mm cannon in the nose. And one day out on patrol in the Bay of Biscay, one of these came up behind my dad's aircraft, opened fire. And the first they knew of it was that parts of the wing were flying off. They realized they were being shot at, dived down to sea level, because at that level, no one could get under the aircraft and attack the unprotected side there. My dad said as they did, the sea beside them was boiling with these shells exploding and more bits were coming off the wing. They knew that they were going to be a sitting duck, and if they didn't do something drastic, they'd be killed. So they came up with a plan, and that plan was to do a hard turn to port And my dad said the aircraft had a built-in headwind, so it immediately did that. It slowed down considerably. And the tail gunner and one of the side gunners was told of this in advance. And as they turned to port, the Focke-Wulf Condor overtook them and both sets of guns opened fire. And the next thing that happened, the Condor was flying away, but going up and down like this. And they reckoned that they'd actually injured or killed the pilot, and the crew were trying to get the pilot out of the seat so they could take control of the aircraft. It was also trailing smoke. The Australians started to follow the aircraft, but realized they couldn't catch it, and they were damaged anyway, so they turned for home. What happened to the Condor is inconclusive, but they think they shot it down. For the next 24 hours, the shore station was actually calling up that aircraft, asking it to report in. After 24 hours, those signals stopped, so they're sure they shot it down. Another interesting thing at Mountbatten, I'll tell you just one thing about Mountbatten. Mountbatten is nothing to do with old Mountbatten that lived at Romsey here. There's a mount there at the base. On top of that, there's a little Martello Tower. And Batten was the civil commander of the garrison there in Plymouth during the English Civil War. So it's named after him. This is a Besson French float plane, which was flown to the UK by a pilot escaping France at the beginning of the war. It actually folds, the float folds up, and also the wings fold in. The purpose of it? Well, it belonged to that French submarine you see top right called the Surcouf. That was a cruiser submarine by virtue of having two 8-inch guns in the turret in front of the conning tower. And behind the conning tower was a little hangar that this aircraft went in. The aircraft was intended to spot the fall of shot from the guns of the submarine. They needed a pilot for this. Another Frenchman escaped from this one from North Africa by hijacking a plane with two of his fellows and flew it to Gibraltar, where it was promptly shot down by the Spanish. Anyway, he got to the UK, and while he was waiting for things to develop, he joined 10 Squadron, learned the worst Australian, and also how to fly a Sunderland. And unfortunately, he was killed when his Sunderland was shot down over the Bay of Biscay. The Surcouf, that sailed with the Allies. Unfortunately, it was sunk with all hands in the West Indies when it got rammed by a merchant ship. Some pictures from Mountbatten days. There's a press photograph there on the left of the Australian cruise outside a hangar. The hangar and that Sunderland were destroyed in a bombing raid. Central photograph is of the tail end of the Sunderland, and you can see the 4-gun turret there. The two right-hand photographs are interesting. The Sunderlands had like panels that folded out from the front of the wings, which cradles went into, and spanned by a plank. Engineers could actually work on the engines. It was the job of the crews of the Sunderlands to do the basic maintenance on the aircraft, refueling it, rearming it, cleaning it, changing the spark plugs. Changing the spark plug is quite a job because the number of cylinders and everything, there were 72 spark plugs on the aircraft. As they were responsible for maintaining the aircraft, the lower ranks used to sleep on board so that if the aircraft was at its moorings and a gale blew up, they could start the engines and compensate for the wind and not pull on the mooring rope. There was another benefit for staying on board, is that they had a little dinghy so they could get to shore, and quite often several of the crew members stayed on board, and after lights out they would get in the rowing boat and row round to the local town and go into the pub for the evening, so they won't be subject to the coming through the guard gate and being told off for being drunk. My dad also was involved in a ferry service between the UK and Alexandria. This was done with Sunderlands that fly out from the UK to Gibraltar, spend the night there, then to Malta, spend the night there, and then on to Alexandria. One of the things that happened when they got there to Alexandria is that the wind blew them into the side of the tanker and damaged the wingtip of the aircraft and the nose. So they were stuck there while parts came out from the UK. During that time, my dad got a bit bored, so he served with the RAAF 230 squadron. One of the things he was involved with was a mission to the southern shore of Crete, where Allied soldiers were stuck with the onslaught by the Germans, and their aim was to go there at night and tell these soldiers that a boat would be coming the following night to take them off. Anyway, my dad went on that mission. It was hot, so he just had his shorts on and his gun in a holster around his belt, and he forgot to put his dog tags on. The dinghy they had was a white one, pristine one, belonged to the Admiral's yacht in Cairo, and they were told in no circumstance it must be damaged or scratched. So my dad was put in charge of the dinghy. The aircraft landed near the shore. The engines were left running. My dad was getting the dinghy out the back door of this thing when shots ran out from the shore. And without more ado, the pilot opened up the engine and started to take off with his dinghy half out the door. Knowing the importance of getting it back, my dad struggled with this on his own, got it on board, and then, really angry, stormed up to the cockpit and said, "Hey, do you remember me?" as he tapped the pilot on his shoulder. And the pilot said, "Oh, Vic, we thought we'd left you behind." So, another close brush with death. Plymouth was a very, very congested harbour with ships coming from France and everywhere and abroad, flying boats operating there. So they were transferred to Pembroke Dock in Wales, which is the second charity I told you about. Pembroke Dock, in previous years, up to about 1920 something, had been a naval dockyard, a bit like Portsmouth, very large. They actually built ships there and maintained them there. In the 1920s, the Navy left the dockyard, relinquished it. In the 1930s, the RAF moved in as a flying boat base. And by the end of the year, there were about 100 flying boats there. So the Australians quite felt at home. The right-hand three pairs of photographs, there's a picture of my dad back in the cockpit again, the same one. That's important to the next story. On a mission out over the Atlantic one wet and squally night, they came back to base trying to find Pembroke Dock. It wasn't lit. They couldn't raise Pembroke Dock by radio or find their way there. They're running low on fuel, so they decided the best thing to do to try and find where they were is do a 360-degree turn, go back towards Ireland, establish where that was, and then come back again. Ireland was easy to find because being a neutral country, there are no lights out, so it was all lit up. So they saw Ireland, turned around, came back again into this cloud, and still couldn't find anything. They're still trying to call up Pembroke Dock. They thought they'd come down a bit lower so they could see below the cloud. And as they did that, there was an almighty crash. The plane hit the sea, and my dad went through the windshield and got stuck between the bars. He came to underwater, struggled out from these bars, came to the surface and found the wings of the flying boat floating on the surface. The hull had broken off in front and behind the wings, and there were 4 other of his crew sat on the wings. 3 of the crew, their bodies floated by. One was later retrieved from the sea and is buried in Pwllheli, and 2 others floated up to the Cumberland coast, or Cumbria coast, and are buried in Witcham St Mary, just north of Barrow-in-Furness. Now, back to the plot. There was 5 of them sitting on the wing with a damaged dinghy and 1 guy injured. They sat there till dawn, and with the dawn, a boat came by in the distance. They had a Very pistol with 2 rockets. They fired 1 in the air. It didn't attract any attention. The boat just kept on sailing. Shortly after that, a pigeon flapped its way across the surface of the water and joined them. Now, the aircraft carried pigeons on board, so if their radio failed, they could release the pigeon and go back to the pigeon loft in Pembroke Dock, and they'd have an account of where they were, perhaps organise some rescue. So I thought, oh, this might help. So they tried the pigeon out in the collar of the wounded guy who was sat there, wrote a message on the piece of paper at the pouch on its leg, threw it up in the air. It took off, flew about 100 yards and flapped into the water again and flapped back to them. They tried this a second time and nothing happened. It came back to them again. They decided to call it Shags, and it joined them on the flying boat wing. Actually, my dad's letters home, he called it Peter. The wing was slowly sinking because the wing fuel tanks were in the wing, and they were almost empty, and they were filling up with water now. So they repaired the dinghy, got in there, put the wounded man in the middle, and all sat around the edge with their legs in the water. Another ship came by in the distance. They fired off both their Veery pistol cartridges as the previous one, so all they could do was shout and wave. It continued sailing away from them. So they were exasperated and gave up. And then all of a sudden the boat turned round and came towards them. And this was the P&O steamer called Bucyrus, which was a coastal steamer. And unfortunately for my dad and his crew, it had been attacked by the Germans the week before in the Channel, and a 550-pound bomb left on the deck. So they weren't too happy about encountering Germans. Anyway, the boat came alongside. The next thing my dad and his mates knew is they're looking up the barrels of several Lee Enfield rifles. The crew on the ship said afterwards they thought they captured a boatload of Germans because they'd been told that the RAAF crews had yellow skull caps, and also these guys weren't wearing RAF uniforms, there's these dark blue ones. Anyway, a stream of Australian invective came up to them, and they were welcome on board, given a bottle of rum, and taken to Holyhead Sailors Hospital, where you see the bottom right photograph. My dad's the one on his left with his arm around a rather disenchanted nurse. Another place they operated from was RAF Oban in Scotland, which is the entrance of Loch Ness. 3 of the Sunderlands were sent up there to help the RAF. And there's my dad on the steps of the Esplanade Hotel with Atty Wern. Bottom main photograph, there's one of the Sunderlands in the Sound there with Carrera Island behind. And my dad, in his photo album, titled this one Miracle at Oban. And I mentioned this to Neil Owen, the curator of the museum up there, and he says, oh, that's because it's not raining, it's always raining up here. And my dad's take on it was, no, it wasn't, it was the rain, the lack of rain, he says. So you got 3 launches out in one go. He said, lucky to get one out when they wanted one. Bottom right photograph is one of these 10 Squadron Sunderlands that crashed on the shore. It had returned at night, and the flight path was twin rows of floating burning oil barrows out in the Sound. They had broken loose and drifted onto the shore. So that particular Sunderland went full pelt up onto the shore and broke up. Several of the crew were killed. And what you see there is the aftermath with the RAF salvage crews removing anything useful from the aircraft that could be reused. Another Oban adventure was the rescue of the crew of the steamship Stan Grant. They were out on patrol in the Sunderland one day over the Atlantic, and this was early in the year, so it was very cold. And one of the crew spotted a lifeboat in the sea beneath them with people in it. And they prevailed upon the captain in charge of the flying boat to land and rescue them. Now, there was a swell running in the sea, which is very dangerous to land on with a flying boat, for if they managed to break off one of the wingtip floats, the aircraft would immediately turn turtle, turn over. There's nothing to keep it up. And the practice, should that happen, was to get all the available crew out onto the other wingtip to keep it afloat, but they wouldn't have been able to take off again. Anyway, they prevailed on the captain of the flying boat. He reluctantly agreed to land. They came alongside the lifeboat, took off all the crew and the captain. You'll see the captain in the middle photograph. He's the one with the scarf and the cap. There were European officers, but all the rest of the crew were Lascars from the Indian subcontinent, and they weren't very well dressed. They were just in light clothes and no shoes on their feet, and several had frostbite. They all came on board. They had to leave their personal possessions behind, and the captain was just allowed to bring on board the box of ship's papers, and there were 20 of them they crammed into the hull of the flying boat. Back to Mountbatten. My dad and his mates gate crashed the 21st birthday of Teresa Miriam Myers, who was working down there for the Prudential Insurance Company, which had been moved out of London. He gate crashed her 21st birthday party, and there was a whirlwind romance. They got married at Romford Church, which you see in the middle there. On the left of my dad there is Atty Wern, the best man. There's my mum there in the middle, and to the right are Jessie and Joe Myers, my grandparents. There's a tail there, and that is Jessie had that brown fur coat for several years, and when we lived down at Lymington, she would come down for Christmas with Joe, and we'd have a grand old time. And one Christmas they rolled up at the front door. Jessie had grey hair, and she'd had it all done for Christmas and with some black streaks in it. And my dad looked at her and he said, "Hi Tubbs, welcome, happy Christmas to you." He says, "You look like a badger looking at the bear's backside." Not the way to speak to your mother-in-law, I don't think, but they were good friends. There's a picture of them, my mum and dad, on the ship going back to Australia. He was recalled to Australia at that time because they needed experienced crews. My dad spent time on the lookout of the ship as they sailed back. And on the right-hand side there is my mum and my dad and my elder brother Bob. He served with 20 and 40 squadrons. 20 was a frontline squadron, 40 was a transport squadron. And they were based at RAAF mines, which is about 80 miles north of Sydney. The base is still there today, and Atty Wern's daughter, Penny, has been involved recently in obtaining a Catalina flying boat, the one you see on the left, and rebuilding it with a group of volunteers, and it's going into the museum at local RAAF Williamtown. The Sunderlands were flown out there, 6 of them were flown out there in the latter part of the war by the USA and the Pacific. They were stripped down and used for transport purposes only. All the armaments had gone. And they used to bring back, take wounded people, take supplies out to New Guinea and places like that. Bottom right is a Martin Mariner, American-built flying boat as well. You notice on the wings of the Sunderland, they're just a 2-colour roundels. It's a blue outer and a white inner. Well, during World War II, British aircraft had the standard RAF roundels with a red centre, but the Japanese also had a red roundel. So, and led to some British aircraft being shot at by their own side. So the blue and white one was adopted. And the current Australian roundel is a blue ring with a white circle with a kangaroo in the middle of it. An interesting aircraft that he flew out there with these German Dornier Do-24 flying boats. He registered several hours in his logbooks on these. These came from the Dutch East Indies, currently Indonesia, and the Dutch had them in their air force there. And when the Dutch regime fell in the East Indies, these were flown to Australia, where they're impressed into the Australian Air Force. And you can see 4 of them at the bottom right there. And they were flown until they run out of spare parts. The 4 down there are being cannibalized for engines and parts and everything. And aside here, another one of interest because it's local, is this aircraft, which is a German Heinkel 115 float plane. Several of these belong to the Norwegian Navy. With the fall of Norway, they were flown to the UK. Left-hand picture, I think, is probably the Firth of Tay at Dundee with the bridge behind. They were flown to the UK and pressed into service. And they were based at Southampton, at Hythe actually, and used to fly spies and agents into France at night. Being German aircraft, the Germans would let them pass through in the evenings. But coming back in the daytime or early morning, they had to summon up an escort of Spitfires to stay being shot down. There's a book you can buy on that or obtain called by John A. Iverack, who was a Canadian serviceman. Oh, it's moved. Sorry, my mouse has gone to sleep. A bit more about the Catalina. A crew of 8. Engines were Pratt & Whitney radial engines. The Australians wanted to fit these to the Sunderlands because they thought they were a better engine. They only needed servicing every 1,000 hours, like the 300 ones on the Sunderland. And when if a propeller engine packed up, you could feather the engine as well. Production was over 4,000 aircraft, and there are many around today. There's one based in the UK at Duxford. Range was considerable, over 4,000 miles, and they used to fly something called the Flight of the Double Sunrise, whereby an aircraft would take off from northwest Australia and fly across the Indian Ocean all the way to Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as is now known, ferrying people and documents and things. So they'd see 2 sunrises. In fact, my dad often encountered that himself because the Catalinas weren't very fast. They'd be prey to Japanese fighters if they're caught in the daylight. So they used to fly by night, mostly, bombing the Japanese. They'd have bombs strapped under the wings. When they ran out of those, they had some inside the fuselage, which they dropped over the side. And when they ran out of those, they'd drop beer bottles with razor blades in the neck over the sides as well. The beer bottles going down made a screaming noise, and my dad said, well, it didn't kill anybody, but they lost a lot of beauty sleep. Some photographs from my dad's album of his Australian life. Top left is his favourite aircraft, which he called Dagwood. Bottom left is one of the Black Cats. These operated specifically at night and were painted black, hence the name. And if you look carefully, you can see a couple of people servicing the engines as they're running. One guy sat on a plank, and if you look carefully, above his head there's a pair of legs poking out underneath the engine cowl. There's somebody inside there, which must be really noisy and very dangerous. Middle photograph is my dad at the bottom there, in a Sunderland cockpit. Top right is Lord Howe Island, which sits in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. There's a small colony of people who live there, primarily growing tomatoes for their seeds. Before the war, there was a ferry service used to go backwards and forwards, taking people and goods, bringing back tomato seed. With the war and Japanese submarine activity, that was suspended. The Australian Air Force had a ferry service going out there and used to quite enjoy that because they'd go fishing and bring back lots of fruit and things. Bottom right hand photograph, my dad titled Coming Back to the Mess One Morning After Bombing Bucha. So they'd been out all night bombing the Japanese, and also they used to supply coast watchers and do reconnoitering as well. The coast watchers were Europeans who'd lived on these Pacific Islands before the Japanese took them over, so they knew their way around there. They went into hiding. They had radios and they could report on Japanese movements, and they themselves had to move considerably because if they got caught by the Japanese, they'd die immediately. Now, I said some Sunderlands actually went out to Australia. This is one of them. What happened to it? Top left-hand corner isn't what they call these days stealth mode. It had actually hit a dolphin on landing. Now, don't think nice chummy amphibians here. A dolphin in this case was a steel pier that you moored ships against, like the ones down at Leap for the D-Day boats. It struck this pier, sank, it was run ashore and then stripped for salvage for parts, and then used for recreational purposes, as you'll see in the middle there. Now, flying boats used to get shot at, and then end up with several bullet holes in the hull. And on one occasion, one of my dad's flying boats was hit by a cannon shell which exploded close to the keel but not breaking it, and left a big hole in the bottom. And they had to get that flying boat ashore somehow when it came into land. So they signalled ahead to say that they got a major hole in the aircraft and needed winching up on the slipway as quickly as they could get it. In the meantime, several of the crew members got a couple of mattresses and stuffed them in the hole and sat in it. And as the aircraft landed, it was actually, they got it to the side of the sound very quickly and up the slipway without losing it. Back to the holes in the hull. To patch the holes in the hull, to make them seaworthy for small holes, they carried plasticine, which we're all familiar with as kids. And my dad, though he was married, I suppose he was on the base and had a few idle hours. Slipped again. Made some gremlins. Well, aviation folk know of gremlins, these little creatures that cause all sorts of mishaps on aircraft and cause them to crash and such. And you've got things there like the wire chewer upper, the rubber eater, the petrol boozer and such. And in his idle hours, my dad made all these with no idea what happened to them. There's a whole family there. Right. Now, my dad's Australian Air Force career came to an end. He resigned. At the end of the war, he was a wing commander. There were very, very few flying jobs available in Australia. The Air Force was shrinking considerably. The only flying jobs he could find for himself were bond flights, where people who'd bought government bonds in the war got the offer of a ride in a tank or a flying boat or a destroyer. So he did those, but there weren't many of them. So he was looking around for a job. And at that point, BOAC advertised for experienced flying boat pilots to come to the UK and fly for the airline, because they were resuming the flying boat services to the Empire. Now, he applied and was accepted and came to the UK, and my mum, he was flown to the UK, and my mum and my elder brother actually came by ship, which took several weeks. They were trained at Poole. I say trained because my dad had over 2,000 flying boat hours in his logbooks at that stage. And all the pilots coming over were subject to being retrained. And they had some fairly ancient pre-war flying boat pilots who were teaching them at Poole Harbour. And they had one guy who was fairly irascible and would pick the smallest fault from his pupils. And he seemed to specialise in very, very bumpy landings, hitting the wave top several times. And on one occasion they land in that way, hit several waves, and immediately they stopped the aircraft, tethered it to the pier and turned the engines off. This teacher turned around to them and said, "Right, time of landing." And from the back of the aircraft comes a voice saying, "I've got 7 here, which one do you want?" Anyway, he flew short Sandringhams up to about 1950 when the flying boat services were finished. Then he went on to Canadair Argonauts, which was a DC-4, however, fitted with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. He then went on to the Bristol Britannia, the Whispering Giant, it was called. He didn't like that aircraft. He said it was too clever and too complicated. And then he transferred to the jetliner, the de Havilland Comet, flying to places listed there. I won't go through them all. And in 1964, he flew the Boeing 707 to very similar places and also to Australia. And in 1971, he finally retired with over 19,000 flying hours in his logbooks. We still have the logbooks in the family, and they've actually been digitized by Poole Flying Boat Celebration. There's a group of enthusiasts down there who built an archive of photographs, and they've been busy digitizing any pilot's logbooks they can get hold of, because these things are fading and deteriorating now. They are open occasionally. They're based at Poole Library at Parkston, so if you want to go down there, look them up and give them a call. And in 1970, when he retired, and he spent a lot of time renovating the Sandringham Beachcomber in Solent Sky. And he was instrumental in getting the Science Museum to buy that aircraft and actually house it in Southampton. The museum was literally built around it. And there are other flying boats in there as well. There's the Saunders Row SRA-1, which is the one and only jet fighter flying boat. The Supermarine S5 as well. And they're getting another aircraft. But in 2010, sadly, he passed away. Here is a Beachcomber, the flying boat in Solent Sky, painted up in Australian colours for Ansett Airlines out to Lord Howe Island, which I mentioned earlier. It had quite a checkered life. In World War II, it was built and put into reserve, and then a plan came to use some Sunderlands to sink the Tirpitz, which was in northern Norway. They weren't going to attack it directly. The plan was to fit two-man torpedoes to the hull of the flying boat, and 4 of the aircraft were selected for this, to fly the aircraft and the torpedo crews out there. The aircraft would land in the sea at night. The guys would man these chariots, go in up the fjord, put mines on the hull of the Tirpitz, come back out after dark, and then they come back to the aircraft and take off. That was the idea. A feasibility study was tried out. They fitted a couple of torpedoes to one of these aircraft. It did take off after 2 miles. Fortunately, probably for everybody involved, the Tirpitz was moved further north in Norway before they could actually carry out that mission, and the aircraft were put into reserve. So at the end of the war, this aircraft was among several that had very few flying hours on it. My dad is actually buried down at Lymington. That's his grave marker. He's got both his ranks there. He's a captain with BOC and a wing commander with the Australian Air Force. He's not alone with famous Australians down there, because for a while, a guy called Captain Arthur Phillip lived down there, who had a farm at Lyndhurst. And Captain Arthur Phillip also commanded what they called the Sea Fencibles down at Lymington, which was like an armed coast guard. And he was the captain of the first fleet out to Australia and the first governor as well. But if you're interested, there's a bit about flying boat museums and societies. I mentioned Cowshot Castle. Pembroke Dock and Solent Sky are the two that benefit from sales of the book. In the first 6 months of its sales, they each received about £300 each, which is very gratifying. I mentioned Poole Flying Boat Celebration in Oban. There's a Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, RAAF museums as well. There's also organisations like the Friends of the New Forest Airfields Heritage Centre. New Forest, especially up to D-Day, probably about 9, 10 different airfields in it, some just for D-Day. And there's Solent Sky Museum, which has Beachcomber. Now that has plans to become the National Flying Boat Museum with the acquisition of another flying boat. This one, Supermarine War, short seagull if you wish. The bottom right, there was the aircraft when it was last on display at RAAF Hendon. It's still got the Australian serial number A24 on it. Top left was when it was newly delivered to Australia, and the two aircraft, other photographs there you see of its interwar years where it had a rather checkered history. But that's coming to Southampton. They're actually expanding the back of the museum to accommodate it. My dad's legacy. There he is in latter years with a glass of wine. You see him in the middle of the right-hand photograph with his two grandsons. David, my brother's son, is on the left there, who flies for BA, he's a captain. And on the right there is our son Sam, who in those days joined the Navy to fly Commando Sea King helicopters, which he did in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now a squadron leader with the Air Force. And just see him on the right there with grandson Noah, and Sam flew Chinooks. Almost there. Like I said, the book is sold and all the royalties go to those two museums. And finally, something else for you. That is the summoning officer in sheepskins on the right.
British coastal station, crews of an Australian flying boat squadron report in the morning for operational order.
What's the job today? Well, no, we have a job. Well, I've just got details from the group. The job this morning is to patrol an area which I will show you on the map. You commence your patrol in that position. You then proceed to there. Yes. And finish your patrol there. Yeah. But be sure to be back at your base by dusk. Yes, very good. There are enemy aircraft operating in these positions here, so keep a good lookout. Yes, right, I'll watch out for them. Yeah, sir.
These regular pilots of the Royal Australian Air Force fly huge Sunderland flying boats 25 tons in weight, battle cruisers of the air. Originally built for use over Australian waters, they were diverted to Britain when war broke out for long-range reconnaissance and escort. In countless expeditions along Atlantic coastlines and over the vast ocean itself, they have proved their magnificent worth. And now let's go with these boys on their patrol. Another flying boat, seemingly suspended in mid-air, keeps us company on the first stage and helps to make this grand picture. On our own now, we check the identity of every ship we encounter. The flying boat is equipped for long trips. A well-appointed galley serves hot food. There is even a mess room where it's served. Suddenly a small object is espied on the ocean surface, the conning tower of a submarine. Is she one of ours or theirs? Destroyers are called up to verify. It's just possible that the crafty U-boat might try to get away with some unexpected trick and steal in on the surface to attack some vital object. But she proves to be a British submarine, and the flying boat passes over her 2 or 3 times in friendly greeting before continuing the patrol. These patrols take them as far south as Gibraltar and as far north as the north of Norway, the whole length, in fact, of our Atlantic blockade. The pilot has now turned his craft on the homeward leg of his journey. No dramatic incident has interrupted his day. It's been just another routine flight, though the weather's not so good out there. Approaching British shores, over numerous vessels safely at anchor, he makes another happy landing.
Have a good trip?
Oh, not bad. Pretty quiet. The weather wasn't too good, though.
Oh. Well, have you seen anything?
Yes, we saw a couple of dornies, but they wouldn't play with us.
The other members of the crew had their own Australian version of the day.
What was the weather like?
Oh,